Imagine a book so powerful that it was deliberately excluded from one of the world's greatest collections of sacred texts. A narrative that blends heroism, betrayal, epic wars, and a cultural revolution that forever changed the course of history. This is the book of 1st Maccabees, a text that, for centuries, was considered too dangerous to be included in the traditional Jewish canon. Why would a story of resistance and the fight for religious freedom be banned? The answer lies within its pages, which not only recount a rebellion against an oppressive empire, but also reveal the complex power dynamics that continue to shape conflicts in the Middle East today. It is a story that begins with an act of defiance in a small town and culminates in the founding of a dynasty that would rule Judea for a century. What makes this book even more fascinating is that it is one of the rare ancient historical texts that has survived almost intact, offering a unique glimpse into a crucial era for three major world religions. Its pages contain not only battles and political intrigues, but also the birth of traditions that persist to this day, including Hanukkah, celebrated annually by millions of Jews worldwide. The story of the Maccabees is a striking testament to how a small group of guerrilla fighters managed to defeat one of the greatest empires of the ancient world, using tactics that would be studied and replicated by resistance movements for the next 2 millennia. It is a narrative that compels us to ask, to what extent should we fight for our beliefs? What is the price of religious freedom? And why are some stories deemed too dangerous to be told? Our story begins at a time of great transformation for the ancient world. As the first chapter of 1 Maccabees, verses 1-4, tells us, Alexander of Macedon, son of King Philip, set out from the land of Kittim and defeated Darius, king of the Persians and Medes, becoming the first ruler over Greece. He fought many battles, captured strongholds, and eliminated kings from the land. He advanced to the ends of the earth, plundering many nations, and the land was silenced before him. But Alexander was not just a ruthless conqueror. During his campaigns, he followed an intriguing policy regarding the peoples he subjugated. When he arrived in Jerusalem, unlike other conquerors, he allowed the Jews to maintain their religious practices and laws, as long as they paid tribute and recognized his authority. This policy of relative tolerance allowed Greek and Jewish cultures to begin blending in ways previously unimaginable. As verses 5 and 6 reveal, Alexander assembled a vast and powerful army. His heart swelled with pride as he dominated regions, nations, and rulers who became his tributaries. But then something unexpected happened. At the height of his power, as verse 7 tells us, he fell ill and realized he was going to die. Before his death, as described in verse 8, he summoned his most noble officers, those who had been raised with him since youth, and divided his kingdom among them. This decision would have profound consequences for the entire known world, especially for the Jewish people. Alexander's death at the age of 33 plunged his vast empire into chaos. As verse 9 recounts, his officers took control, each in their respective regions, and after his death, they all placed crowns upon their heads, and their sons after them, bringing many evils upon the land for years to come. Among these successors, 2 kingdoms became particularly significant for Jewish history: the Ptolemaic kingdom in Egypt and the Seleucid kingdom in Syria. The land of Israel, caught between these 2 powers, became a constant battleground. In verse 10, we are introduced to a central figure in our story. From them came forth a sinful root, Antiochus Epiphanes, son of King Antiochus. This man had been a hostage in Rome, and upon assuming the throne of the Seleucid Empire in 175 BCE, he brought with him very different ideas about governance. The reign of Antiochus Epiphanes marked a dramatic shift in policy toward the Jews. Whereas Alexander had allowed religious freedom, Antiochus had other plans. As verses 11 to 15 tell us, in those days wicked men arose from Israel and led many. astray, saying, "Let us make a covenant with the surrounding nations, for ever since we have separated from them, many evils have come upon us." This proposal found support among some sectors of Jewish society, particularly among the more Hellenized elites of Jerusalem. They built a gymnasium according to the customs of the Gentiles, concealed the mark of circumcision, and abandoned the sacred covenant, aligning themselves with non-Jews and selling themselves to do evil. The situation worsened when, as described in verses 16-19, Antiochus, feeling secure in his kingdom, decided to conquer Egypt in an attempt to rule over two kingdoms. He invaded Egypt with a powerful army, including chariots, elephants, cavalry, and a great fleet. After waging war against Ptolemy, the king of Egypt, Ptolemy retreated and fled, and many fell wounded. The fortified cities of Egypt were captured, and Antiochus seized the spoils of the land. However, Antiochus's ambition was soon checked by the Romans, who were already emerging as a Mediterranean superpower. Forced to abandon his claims over Egypt, he turned his attention and his frustration toward Jerusalem. In 169 BCE, after returning from his conquest of Egypt, as verses 20-24 recount, Antiochus marched against Israel and Jerusalem with a powerful army. He entered the sanctuary arrogantly and took the golden altar, the menorah with all its utensils, the table of showbread, the vessels for drink offerings, the cups, the golden censers, the veil, the crowns, and the golden decoration on the facade of the temple, seizing everything. The plundering of the temple was only the beginning. As described in verses 25-28, he took the silver, gold, and precious objects, seized the hidden treasures he found, and taking everything, returned to his land. He carried out a great massacre and spoke with great arrogance. There was deep mourning in Israel and throughout its territories. Leaders and elders groaned, virgins and young men lost their vigor, and the beauty of the women faded. 2 years later, in 167 BC, the situation worsened even further. As reported in verses 29-32, the king sent an official to the cities of Judah. This envoy arrived in Jerusalem with a powerful army and spoke peaceful words to the inhabitants, who believed him. Then suddenly, he launched an attack on the city, struck it a severe blow, and killed many people in Israel. It was at this moment that Antiochus initiated his most aggressive policy of Hellenization. As described in verses 41-50, he issued a decree throughout his kingdom, commanding that all people become one and abandon their particular customs. The king prohibited burnt offerings, sacrifices, and libations in the temple, profaned the Sabbaths and festivals, and ordered the construction of altars, temples, and idols. He mandated the sacrifice of pigs and other unclean animals, forbade circumcision, and forced the people to defile themselves with all sorts of impurity and desecration. The objective was clear. Anyone who did not comply with the king's orders would be condemned to death. Antiochus' policy posed an existential threat not only to Jewish religious practices, but to the very identity of the Jewish people. Many in Israel accepted his religion, sacrificed to idols, and profaned the Sabbath. However, as told in verses 62-64, many in Israel remained steadfast and resolved in their hearts not to eat impure food. They preferred to die rather than defile themselves with such food and break the holy covenant. And so they perished. It was a time of great wrath upon Israel. The situation in Jerusalem worsened day by day, as recounted in the first chapter of 1 Maccabees, verses 41-43. King Antiochus issued a decree throughout his kingdom, commanding all peoples to abandon their customs and become one people. All the nations complied with the king's order, and many Israelites accepted the prescribed worship, sacrificing to idols and profaning the Sabbath. The persecution became more systematic and brutal. As described in verses 44-47, The king sent messengers with letters to Jerusalem and all the cities of Judah, ordering them to adopt foreign customs. They were to suppress burnt offerings, sacrifices, and libations in the sanctuary, profane the Sabbaths and festivals, and defile the sanctuary and holy things. He also ordered the construction of altars, temples, and idols, the sacrifice of pigs and other unclean animals, the abandonment of circumcision, and the corruption of the people with every kind of impurity and desecration, so that they would forget the law and change all their customs. The severity of the punishments was terrifying. As told in verses 48 to 50, anyone who did not obey the king's orders was condemned to death. Antiochus issued this decree throughout his kingdom and appointed overseers over the people, commanding the cities of Judah to offer sacrifices one by one. The impact of these measures on the Jewish community was devastating. Verses 51 to 53 reveal that many among the people, those who abandoned the law, joined the overseers and committed evil throughout the land. They forced the faithful of Israel to hide wherever they could find refuge. The profanation of the temple was one of the most traumatic moments of this period. As narrated in verses 54 to 56, on the 15th day of the month of Kislev, in the year 145 Seleucid calendar, the king ordered the construction of the abomination of desolation upon the altar of burnt offerings. They also built altars in the surrounding cities of Judah, and in front of house doors and public squares they burned incense. The destruction of sacred books was another tactic used to try to eradicate the Jewish faith. Verses 57 to 59 tell that they tore up and burned any books of the law they found. If someone was discovered in possession of a book of the covenant or was found to be living according to the law, the king's decree sentenced them to death. Passive resistance began to emerge among the people. As described in verses 60 to 63, they exercised their power month after month against the Israelites found in the cities. On the 25th day of each month, they offered sacrifices on the altar erected over the altar of burnt offerings. Women who had circumcised their sons were executed as ordered, with their children hanging from their necks, along with their relatives and those who had performed the circumcision. However, many in Israel remained steadfast. Verses 64 to 67 recount that many in Israel stood firm and resolved in their hearts not to eat impure food. They preferred to die rather than defile themselves with such food and break the holy covenant. And so they perished. A great wrath fell upon Israel. The persecution spread throughout Judea. In every city, Antiochus's officials sought to identify and punish those who remained faithful to the law. Entire families were forced to hide in caves and remote places. Synagogues were either converted into pagan temples or completely destroyed. One of the most striking episodes of this period was the martyrdom of a mother and her 7 sons, as recounted in the second book of Maccabees. Although not directly part of the narrative in the first book, this event illustrates the brutality of the persecution and the strength of passive resistance. The family was imprisoned and tortured for refusing to eat pork, which was forbidden by Jewish law. The situation in Jerusalem became particularly dire. The temple, the center of Jewish religious life, was not only profaned but transformed into a place of worship for Olympian Zeus. Priests who refused to participate in pagan rituals were executed. Those who collaborated were rewarded with positions of power and privileges. The daily life of devout Jews became a constant exercise in resistance and survival. Observing the Sabbath, performing circumcision, studying the Torah, or even possessing a scroll of the scriptures were acts that could result in death. Families developed codes and secret signals to communicate and maintain their religious practices. Jewish merchants and traders faced a particular dilemma. To continue their businesses, they were often forced to participate in pagan rituals or handle foods prohibited by the law. Many abandoned their professions to uphold their faith, leading to an economic crisis within Jewish communities. The surveillance system implemented by Antiochus was extensive. In every village and city, inspectors were assigned to ensure compliance with the new laws. They were assisted by local informants, often Hellenized Jews, who saw an opportunity to gain favor with the Seleucid authorities. Resistance began to organize in different ways. Some groups sought refuge in the desert, living an ascetic life while secretly maintaining their religious practices. Others remained in the cities, creating clandestine networks to preserve and transmit the teachings of the Torah. The Hasidim, a group of pious Jews, began to gain influence as spiritual leaders of the resistance. Women played a crucial role during this period. In addition to maintaining domestic traditions and educating their children in the Jewish faith, many risked their lives to perform the circumcision of their infants and uphold kosher dietary laws. Some became messengers between different resistance groups. The impact of persecution extended beyond the borders of Judea. Jewish communities throughout the Seleucid Empire faced similar pressures to abandon their practices. The diaspora grew as some families fled to more tolerant regions, such as Ptolemaic Egypt. It was in this context of increasing oppression that a spark of active resistance emerged in a small town called Modin. As we shall see, it was there that an elderly priest named Matathias, along with his 5 sons, would ignite a revolt that would change the course of Jewish history. Amidst the intense persecution spreading across Judea, a figure emerged who would alter the course of Jewish history. As told in 1 Maccabees chapter 2, verses 1 to 5, in those days Matathias, son of John, son of Simeon, a priest of the Jorib lineage, left Jerusalem and settled in Modin. He had 5 sons: John, surnamed Gadi, Simon called Thassi, Judas called Maccabeus, Eleazar called Avaran, and Jonathan called Aphus. Matathias was no ordinary man. As a priest of the Jorib order, one of the 24 divisions of the Bay priesthood established by King David, he bore a special responsibility toward his people. In Modin, a small town in the hills northwest of Jerusalem, he witnessed with great distress the events unfolding around him. As described in verses 6 to 7, upon seeing the blasphemies committed in Judah and Jerusalem, Matathias exclaimed, "Woe is me! Why was I born to see the ruin of my people and the destruction of the holy city, to sit idly while it is handed over to the enemies and the sanctuary is in the hands of foreigners?" Matathias's sorrow was deep and personal. Verses 8 to 11 reveal his lament. The temple had become like a man without honor. Its glorious vessels had been taken as spoils, its elders massacred in the streets, and its young men fallen by the sword of the enemy. What nation had not seized its lands and plundered its riches? The situation in Modin reached a critical point when, as narrated in verses 15 to 18, the king's emissaries arrived in the town to enforce apostasy and conduct sacrifices. Many Israelites approached them, but Matathias and his sons remained apart. The king's envoys addressed Matathias, "You are a leader honored and great in this city, and you have the support of sons and brothers. Come forward first and fulfill the king's decree, as all the nations, the men of Judah, and those who remain in Jerusalem have done. Then you and your sons will be counted among the king's friends, and you will be honored with silver, gold, and many gifts." Matathias's response, recorded in verses 19 to 22, was a powerful declaration of faith and resistance. "Even if all the nations under the king's dominion obey him, forsaking the worship of their ancestors and submitting to his decrees, I, my sons and my brothers, will continue to follow the covenant of our ancestors. May heaven forbid that we abandon the law and its commandments. We will not obey the king's orders to turn away from our worship, neither to the right nor to the left." The decisive moment came when, as described in verses 23 to 26, as soon as Matathias had spoken these words, a Jew stepped forward in the sight of all to sacrifice on the altar in Modane, following the king's order. Seeing this, Matathias was filled with righteous zeal. His heart trembled, and his anger flared according to the law. Rushing to the altar, he struck down the man and also killed the king's envoy who had been forcing the sacrifice, then destroyed the altar. This act by Matathias, though violent, was a crucial moment that ignited the revolt. As verses 27 to 28 recount, after performing this act, Matathias cried out through the city, "Let everyone who is zealous for the law and upholds the covenant follow me." And he fled to the mountains with his sons, leaving behind everything they possessed in the city. The response of the people was remarkable. Verses 29 and 30 state that many who sought justice and righteousness withdrew to the wilderness, taking their children, wives, and livestock with them, for the oppression had grown unbearable. The news of the revolt quickly reached the authorities in Jerusalem. As described in verses 31 to 38, the king's officials and troops in Jerusalem, in the city of David, were informed that men who had defied the king's command had fled to hideouts in the wilderness. Many pursued them and caught up with them. They camped in front of them and prepared to attack them on the Sabbath day. What happened next demonstrated the dilemma faced by faithful Jews. Verses 39 and 40 tell us that the soldiers said, "That's enough. Come out, obey the king's command, and save your lives." But they replied, "We will not come out, nor will we obey the king's command to profane the Sabbath day." The ensuing tragedy was devastating. As recorded in verses 41 to 48, the soldiers attacked immediately. The Jews did not retaliate, did not throw stones, nor did they block the entrances to their hiding places. They said, "Let us all die in our innocence. Heaven and earth are witnesses that you are killing us unjustly." And so they were attacked on the Sabbath, and they died, men, women, children, and even their livestock, about 1,000 people. This tragedy led Matathias and his followers to a crucial decision. Verses 49 to 51 reveal that when Matathias and his friends heard of this, they mourned deeply for them. They said to one another, "If we all do as our brothers did and refuse to fight against the Gentiles for our lives and our traditions, they will soon wipe us off the face of the earth." That day, they made a decisive resolution. If anyone comes to attack us on the Sabbath, we will fight back so that we do not all die as our brothers did in the hiding places. The resistance movement began to grow. As described in verses 42 to 44, the Hasidians, valiant men of Israel, all devoted to the law, joined them. Likewise, all those fleeing from oppression joined them, strengthening their ranks. They organized an army and struck down sinners in their wrath and the wicked in their fury. Those who escaped took refuge among the Gentiles to save themselves. Matathias and his sons traveled throughout the land, as recounted in verses 45 to 48, destroying pagan altars, forcibly circumcising uncircumcised children they found in Israel, pursuing the arrogant and making their mission prosper. They rescued the law from the power of the Gentiles and their kings, and did not allow the sinner to prevail. As his life neared its end, Matathias gathered his sons to give them his final instructions. As recorded in verses 49 to 50, when the days of Matathias's death drew near, he said to his sons, "Arrogance and disgrace now reign. It is a time of ruin and fierce wrath." In his final speech, found in verses 51 to 68, Matathias reminded his sons of the great examples of faith in Israel's history. He spoke of Abraham, who was found faithful in trial, of Joseph, who kept the commandment in his time of distress, of Phinehas, who received the covenant of eternal priesthood for his zeal, of Joshua, who became a judge in Israel, of Caleb, who received an inheritance in the land, of David, who obtained the royal throne forever, of Elijah, who was taken up to heaven for his zeal for the law, of Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, who were saved from the flames, and of Daniel, who was delivered from the lion's den. His final words were a call to courage and faithfulness. Consider then, from generation to generation, all who hope in him will not perish. Do not fear the sinner's threats, for his glory will end in filth and worms. Today he exalts himself, but tomorrow he will not be found, for he will have returned to dust, and his plans will have perished. As described in verses 69 and 70, Matathias died in the year 146 and was buried in the tomb of his ancestors in Modane. All of Israel mourned him greatly. Before his death, he established a leadership structure among his sons. Simon was to be the counselor, for he was a prudent man, and Judas Maccabeus, because of his strength since youth, would be the commander of the army. After Matathias' death, his son Judas, known as Maccabeus, took up the leadership of the resistance. As told in the 3rd chapter of Maccabees, verses 1 to 9, Judas, called Maccabeus, rose in his place. All his brothers and all who had followed his father supported him and fought the battle for Israel with joy. He extended the glory of his people, put on his armor like a giant, girded his weapons of war, and waged battles, defending the camp with his sword. He became like a lion in his exploits, like a young lion roaring over its prey. He pursued the wicked, seeking them out, and burned those who disturbed his people. The wicked retreated in fear of him. All evildoers were thrown into confusion, and deliverance advanced by his hand. The impact of Judas' leadership was immediate. As described in verses 10 to 12, he brought grief to many kings, but brought joy to Jacob with his exploits, and his memory will be blessed forever. He went through the cities of Judah, eliminated the wicked from them, and turned away Israel's wrath. His name reached the ends of the earth, and he gathered those who were on the brink of perishing. Judas's first great battle was against Apollonius, the governor of Samaria. As verses 13 to 15 recount, Apollonius gathered Gentiles and a great army from Samaria to fight against Israel. When Judas learned of this, he went out to meet him, defeated him, and killed him. Many fell wounded, and the rest fled. They took their spoils, and Judas kept Apollonius's sword and fought with it for the rest of his days. Judas's fame grew, and soon he faced an even greater challenge. Verses 16 to 22 tell us that Horon, commander of the Syrian army, upon hearing that Judas had gathered around him an assembly of faithful and men of war, decided to march against him. Horon said, "I will make a name for myself and cover myself in glory in the kingdom. I will fight against Judas and his companions, who despise the king's command." A powerful army of the wicked went up with him to aid him and take vengeance on the sons of Israel. The situation seemed desperate, as described in verses 23 to 26. When Horon approached the ascent of Beth Horon, Judas went out to meet him with a small group. Seeing the army coming against them, Judas's men said to him, "How can we, so few in number, fight against such a powerful multitude? Moreover, we are weakened today by fasting." Judas's response, recorded in verses 18 to 22, revealed his deep faith. It is easy for many to be delivered into the hands of a few, for in heaven's sight there is no difference between saving by many or by few. Victory in war does not depend on the number of soldiers, but on the strength that comes from heaven. They come against us filled with arrogance and wickedness to destroy us, our wives and our children, and to plunder us. But we fight for our lives and for our laws. Heaven itself will crush them before us. Do not be afraid of them. The battle that followed was decisive. As narrated in verses 23 to 25, as soon as Judas finished speaking, he suddenly launched an attack against them, and Horon and his army were defeated before him. They pursued them down the descent of Beth Horon to the plain, About 800 of their men fell, and the rest fled to the land of the Philistines. The fear of Judas and his men began to spread. Verses 26 and 27 tell us that the dread of Judas and his brothers, and the terror of them, started to fall upon the neighboring nations. His name reached even the king, and all the nations were talking about Judas's battles. King Antiochus's response was furious. As described in verses 27 to 37, when King Antiochus heard these reports, he was enraged. He ordered the assembly of all the forces of his kingdom, a very powerful army. He opened his treasury and gave his troops a year's wages, instructing them to be ready for any eventuality. However, Antiochus faced his own problems. As detailed in verses 31 to 37, he realized that his coffers were running low and that the region's tributes were insufficient due to the unrest and calamities he had caused by abolishing the laws that had existed from ancient times. Fearing that he would not have enough for his expenses and the gifts he had previously given with lavish generosity, he decided to go to Persia to collect the tributes from those provinces. Before departing, as recorded in verses 38 to 41, he left Lysias, a nobleman of royal blood, in charge of the king's affairs from the Euphrates River to the borders of Egypt, and to educate his son Antiochus until his return. He entrusted him with half of the army and the war elephants, giving him instructions on everything he wanted to be done, particularly concerning the inhabitants of Judea and Jerusalem. He was to send an army against them to crush and destroy the forces of Israel and what remained of Jerusalem, erasing their memory from that place. Lysias wasted no time. As described in chapter 4, verses 1 to 11, he chose Ptolemy, son of Dorymenes, Nicanor and Gorgias, powerful men among the king's friends, and sent them with 40,000 infantry and 7,000 cavalry to invade the land of Judah and lay it to waste, according to the king's orders. They set out with their entire army and camped near Emmaus in the plain. News of this vast force reached Judas, as narrated in verses 12 to 15, when Judas and his brothers saw that the calamities had increased and that the armies were encamped in their territory, knowing the king's orders to destroy and annihilate the people, they said to one another, "Let us lift our people from ruin and fight for our people and our sanctuary." The assembly gathered to prepare for war. As described in verses 41 to 46, they fasted that day, put on sackcloth, sprinkled ashes on their heads, and tore their garments. They unrolled the book of the law to consult it, just as the Gentiles would consult the images of their idols. They brought out the priestly vestments, the first fruits and the tithes, and summoned the Nazirites who had completed their vows. Crying out to heaven, they said, "What shall we do with these men? Where shall we take them? Your sanctuary has been trampled and profaned, and your priests are in mourning and humiliation. Behold, the nations have united against us to destroy us. You know their plans against us. How can we stand against them unless you help us?" It was then that Judas organized his army. As we read in verses 42 to 61, he divided the people into groups of 1,000, 100, 50, and 10. He told those who were building houses, those who had recently married, those who were planting vineyards, and the fearful to return home, as permitted by the law. Then he broke camp and stationed himself south of Emmaus. Judas declared, "Gird yourselves and be brave. Be ready to fight early in the morning against these nations that have gathered against us to destroy us, our people, and our sanctuary. It is better to die in battle than to witness the calamities of our nation and the desecration of the holy place. As heaven wills, so let it be done." The battle that followed was one of Judas's greatest military triumphs. With strategy and faith, he achieved an astonishing victory against vastly superior forces, establishing his reputation as one of the greatest military leaders in Jewish history. This victory paved the way for the recapture of Jerusalem and the purification of the temple, one of the most significant moments in the Maccabean revolt. After the victory over Gorgias' forces and the purification of the temple, Judas Maccabeus faced new challenges. As recounted in the 5th chapter of 1 Maccabees verses 1 to 3, when the surrounding nations heard that the altar had been rebuilt and the sanctuary restored to its former state, they became greatly enraged. They resolved to eliminate the descendants of Jacob living among them and began to attack and kill the people. The situation for the Jews in neighboring regions was particularly perilous. In the region of Gilead, as described in verses 9 to 13, the other nations gathered against the Israelites living in their territory with the intent to annihilate them. These Israelites fled to the fortress of Datama and sent letters to Judas and his brothers, saying, "The nations surrounding us have gathered to exterminate us. They are preparing to attack the fortress where we have taken refuge, and their army is led by Timotheus. Come and rescue us from their hands, for many of our people have already fallen." At the same time, as revealed in verses 14 and 15, other messengers arrived from Galilee with their garments torn, bringing similar news. People from Ptolemais, Tyre and Sidon, along with all of the foreign Galilee, have gathered against us to destroy us. Judas's response was swift and strategic. As narrated in verses 16 to 20, when Judas and the people heard these words, a great assembly was gathered to deliberate on how to help their brethren who were in distress and under attack from these nations. Judas said to his brother Simon, "Choose men for yourself and go rescue our brothers in Galilee. My brother Jonathan and I will go to the region of Gilead." He left Joseph, son of Zechariah, and Azariah as leaders of the people, along with the rest of the army in Judea for its defense, ordering them, "Take charge of this people, but do not engage in battle with the nations until we return." Simon's campaign in Galilee was a remarkable success. As described in verses 21 to 23, Simon was given 3,000 men for the expedition to Galilee, while Judas was assigned 8,000 for the region of Gilead. Simon set out for Galilee and engaged in numerous battles with the pagans. They were defeated before him, and he pursued them to the gates of Ptolemais. About 3,000 of the enemy fell, and he seized their spoils. Meanwhile, Judas and Jonathan faced even greater challenges in Gilead. As recounted in verses 24 to 28, they crossed the Jordan and marched for 3 days through the wilderness. They encountered the Nabateans, who received them peacefully and informed them of everything that had happened to their brethren in Gilead. That many were imprisoned in Bozrah, Bosor, Alema, Caspho, Mased, and Carnaim, large fortified cities. There were also captives in other cities of Gilead, and an attack on the fortresses had been planned for the following day, intending to take them and annihilate them all in one strike. Judas's reaction was immediate and decisive. As detailed in verses 29 to 34, he swiftly redirected his army toward the wilderness of Bozrah. He took the city and put all the men to the sword. He seized all their spoils and set the city on fire. That night he marched onward to the fortress. At dawn, when they lifted their eyes, they saw an innumerable multitude raising ladders and siege engines to capture the stronghold, and the attack had already begun. The battle was intense, as described in verses 35 to 43, when Judas saw that the battle had commenced and that the city's cries rose to the heavens with the sound of trumpets and great shouting. He said to his men, "Fight today for our brothers." He led 3 columns to strike from the enemy's rear. They sounded the trumpets and called out in prayer. Timothy's army recognized that it was the Maccabee and fled before him. He inflicted a great defeat upon them. About 8,000 of them fell that day. The campaign continued with equal success, as narrated in verses 44 to 54. Judas then turned to Alema. He attacked it, captured it, and after killing all its men, seized their spoils and set it on fire. From there, he moved on and took Caspho, Mesed, Bosor, and the other cities of Gilead. Timothy, however, did not give up easily. As told in verses 55 to 68, he assembled another army and camped in front of Raphon on the other side of the stream. Judas sent scouts to examine the camp, and they reported, "All the pagans surrounding us have gathered with him, forming a massive army. They have also hired Arabs as auxiliaries, and they are camped on the other side of the stream, ready to attack you." Judas advanced to meet them. The decisive battle that followed was fierce. As described in verses 42 to 44, Judas and his army crossed the stream toward them. Timothy told his commanders, "If he crosses over to us first, we will not be able to withstand him, for he will have a great advantage over us. But if he hesitates and camps on the other side, we will cross over to him and defeat him." Once again, Judas' leadership made the difference. As narrated in verses 45 to 54, when he approached the stream, he stationed the scribes of the people along the water and ordered them, "Let no one stay behind. Everyone must go into battle." He crossed first against them, and all the people followed behind him. All the pagans were defeated before them, threw away their weapons, and fled to the temple of Carnim. But the Jews seized the city and burned the temple with everyone inside. Thus, Carnim was subdued, and they could no longer resist Judas. After these victories, as described in verses 45 to 54, Judas gathered all the Israelites who were in the region of Gilead, young and old, along with their wives, children, and belongings, a very large caravan, to lead them back to the land of Judah. They arrived at Ephron, a large and well-fortified city situated on the passageway. Since the inhabitants refused to let them pass, Judas was forced to take the city by force. The strength of the Maccabees continued to grow. As recounted in verses 55 to 62, after this, they crossed the Jordan into the Great Plain before Beth Shan. Along the way, Judas gathered those who had fallen behind and encouraged the people throughout the journey until they reached the land of Judah. They then ascended Mount Zion with joy and rejoicing, offering burnt offerings, for none of them had fallen. They had returned in peace. While Judas and Jonathan were in the region of Gilead, and their brother Simon was in Galilee near Ptolemais, the commanders Joseph, son of Zechariah, and Azariah, who had remained in charge of the rest of the army in Judea, heard of the great deeds and battles the others had fought. As described in verses 55 to 62, they said, "Let us also make a name for ourselves and go fight against the nations around us." This decision, contrary to Judas's explicit orders, led to disaster. As narrated in verses 63 to 68, when they commanded the troops with them and marched against Jamnia, Gorgias came out of the city with his men to fight against them. Joseph and Azarias were put to flight as far as the borders of Judea. About 2,000 men of the people of Israel fell that day. It was a great defeat for the people because they had not obeyed Judas and his brothers, imagining that they would perform acts of bravery. They were not of the lineage of those men, through whose hands Israel's deliverance had been granted. During this period, Antiochus IV, or Epiphanes, who had set out for Persia in search of resources, met his end. As recounted in chapter 6, verses 1 to 4, while traveling through the upper regions, he heard of Elymai, a city in Persia famous for its wealth, silver and gold. There was a very rich temple there, where golden armor, breastplates and weapons left behind by Alexander, son of Philip, king of Macedonia, the first to reign over the Greeks, were stored. He went there, intending to seize and plunder the city, but he failed because his plan became known to the inhabitants. The story takes a dramatic turn with the death of Antiochus IV Epiphanes. As told in 1 Maccabees chapter 6, verses 5 to 13, When Antiochus realized that he had failed, he withdrew in deep sorrow and returned to Babylon. It was then that a messenger came to inform him in Persia that the armies sent to Judea had been put to flight, that Lysias, who had led a powerful army, had been repelled by the Jews, who had grown stronger thanks to the weapons, resources, and abundant spoils taken from the defeated armies. They had also destroyed the abomination that he had set up on the altar in Jerusalem, and had surrounded the sanctuary with high walls as before, as well as Bethzur, the king's city. The news of these defeats had a devastating effect on Antiochus. As described in verses 8 to 13, upon hearing such news, he was overcome with shock and violently distressed. He fell ill from grief because things had not turned out as he had wished. He remained there for many days, his deep sorrow continually renewed. When he realized that he was going to die, he called all his friends and said, "Sleep has fled from my eyes, and my heart fails with anguish. I said in my heart, to what tribulation have I come, and into what waves of sorrow am I now plunged? I, who was kind and beloved in my power. But now I remember the evils I committed in Jerusalem, where I took all the gold and silver vessels that were there and ordered the unjust slaughter of the inhabitants of Judah. I acknowledge that it is because of this that these misfortunes have come upon me, and behold, I am dying in deep grief in a foreign land." With the death of Antiochus, his son, Antiochus the fair Eupator, ascended the throne while still young. As narrated in verses 14 to 17, he summoned Philip, one of his friends, and appointed him over his entire kingdom. He handed him the diadem, his robe, and his ring, so that he might guide Antiochus, his son, and educate him for the throne. King Antiochus died there in the year 149. When Lysias learned that the king was dead, he established his son Antiochus, whom he had raised since childhood, as king in his place and gave him the name Eupator. The struggle for power within the Seleucid Empire would have direct consequences for the Jews. As told in chapter 7, verses 1 to 7, in the year 151, Demetrius, son of Seleucus, having departed from Rome, arrived with a few men in a coastal city, and began to reign there. When he entered the royal palace of his ancestors, the army seized Antiochus and Lysias to bring them before him. Upon being informed of this, he said, "Do not show me their faces." The army killed them, and Demetrius took his seat on the throne of his kingdom. It was in this context that Alkimus emerged, a figure who would change the course of events. As described in verses 5 to 7, all the wicked and impious men of Israel came to him, led by Alkimus, who sought to become high priest. They accused the people before the king, saying, "Judas and his brothers have destroyed all your friends and have driven us out of our land. Therefore, now send a man you trust to go and see all the ruin they have caused to us, as well as to the provinces of the king, and to punish them and their supporters." King Demetrius decided to act. As narrated in verses 8 to 20, he chose Maccabeus, one of the king's trusted friends, governor of the region beyond the river, an important man in the kingdom and loyal to the king. He sent him with the impious Alkimus, whom he appointed as high priest, ordering him to take vengeance on the children of Israel. They set out with a great army for the land of Judah. They sent messengers to Judas and his brothers with peaceful but deceitful words. However, they did not heed them, for they saw that they had come with a great army. Nevertheless, some scribes and righteous men among the people were deceived. As described in verses 12 to 18, a group of scribes gathered with Alkimus and Maccabees, seeking a just resolution. The Hasidians were the first among the children of Israel to seek peace with them, saying, "A priest of Aaron's lineage has come with the troops. He will not deceive us." Alkimus spoke to them peacefully and swore to them, "We will do you no harm, nor to your friends." They believed him, but he had 60 of them seized and killed in one day, according to the word that is written, "The flesh of your saints and their blood they have shed around Jerusalem, and there was no one to bury them." This betrayal by Alkimus caused great terror. As narrated in verses 19 to 25, fear and trembling seized the whole people, who said, "There is neither truth nor justice in them, for they have violated the covenant and the oath they made." Maccabeus left Jerusalem and camped at Beth. He ordered the capture of many of those who had defected to him, as well as some of the people, and had them killed, casting them into a deep pit. He then entrusted the province to Alkimus, leaving troops to support him, and returned to the king. The reign of Alkimus was marked by violence and oppression. As described in verses 21 to 25, Alkimus sought the high priesthood. All the troublemakers of his people gathered around him, seized the land of Judah, and caused great tribulation in Israel. When Judas saw all the evil that Alkimus and his followers inflicted upon the children of Israel, worse than the Gentiles, he traveled throughout the territory of Judah, seeking vengeance against the deserters. Thus he prevented them from spreading throughout the land. The situation worsened when, as recounted in verses 26 to 32, Alkimus, realizing that Judas and his followers had grown stronger and that he could not withstand them, returned to the king and accused them of serious crimes. The king then sent Nicanor, one of his most distinguished generals, who hated and opposed Israel, ordering him to exterminate the people. Nicanor's arrival marked the beginning of a new phase in the conflict. As narrated in verses 33 to 38, Nicanor came to Jerusalem with a large army and deceitfully sent peaceful words to Judas and his brothers. "Let there be no war between us. I will come with a few men to meet you in peace." He went to Judas, and they greeted each other in peace, but the enemies were prepared to capture Judas. However, Judas realized that Nicanor had come with malicious intent. He feared him and refused to see his face again. Tension escalated further when, as described in verses 39 to 47, Nicanor discovered that his plan had been exposed and marched against Judas to fight near Kafar Salama. About 500 men from Nicanor's army fell, and the rest fled to the city of David. After these events, Nicanor went up to Mount Zion. Some of the priests came out of the holy place with the elders of the people to greet him peacefully and show him the burnt offering that was offered for the king. However, he mocked them, ridiculed them, profaned them, and spoke arrogantly. Filled with rage, he swore, "If Judas and his army are not handed over to me immediately, as soon as I return victorious, I will burn down this building." And he left in great fury. The priests entered, and standing before the altar and the temple weeping, they said, "You have chosen this house for your name to be invoked upon it, and to be a house of prayer and supplication for your people. Take vengeance upon this man and his army, and let them fall by the sword. Remember his blasphemies and do not let them prevail." After the death of Judas Maccabeus, his brother Jonathan assumed leadership of the resistance. As told in 1 Maccabees, chapter 9, verses 28 to 31, Judas's friends gathered and said to Jonathan, "Since your brother Judas died, there is no one like him to go out against the enemies, against Maccabees and the adversaries of our nation. Therefore today we choose you to be our leader and commander in his place, so that you may continue our war." Jonathan accepted the leadership at that moment and rose in place of his brother Judas. The situation was extremely delicate, as described. In verses 32 to 34, when Maccabeus learned of this, he sought a way to kill Jonathan. But Jonathan, his brother Simon, and all who were with him upon hearing this, fled to the wilderness of Tekoa and camped by the waters of the Asphar cistern. The persecution was intense. As narrated in verses 43 to 49, a great battle took place, and many on both sides fell wounded. Jonathan stretched out his hand to strike Maccabeus, but he dodged backward. Then Jonathan and those with him jumped into the Jordan River and swam across to the other side. The others did not cross the Jordan after them. About 1,000 men from Maccabees' army fell that day. Jonathan's strength gradually grew. As told in verses 58 to 61, all the wicked and ungodly of Israel gathered in council, saying, "Behold, Jonathan and his men live in peace and confidence. Let us now summon Maccabees. He will capture them all in a single night." They went to him and advised him accordingly. Maccabees set out with a great army and secretly instructed all his allies in Judea to seize Jonathan and his followers. But they failed, for their plan was discovered. Jonathan's leadership solidified through his diplomatic and military skills. As described in chapter 10, verses 1 to 6, in the year 160, Alexander Epiphanes, son of Antiochus, rose and took Ptolemais. He was welcomed and began to reign there. When King Demetrius learned of this, he gathered a vast army and set out against him. Demetrius also sent a letter to Jonathan with peaceful words to elevate him. This was a crucial moment that demonstrated Jonathan's political astuteness. As narrated in verses 7 to 14, Demetrius said, "Let us hasten to make peace with him, before he makes peace with Alexander against us. For he will remember all the harm we caused him, his brothers, and his nation." He authorized Jonathan to recruit an army and manufacture weapons, declaring him his ally. He also ordered that the hostages in the citadel be handed over to him. Jonathan's response was strategic, as described in verses 15 to 21. When Alexander heard of all the promises Demetrius had made to Jonathan, he was also informed of the battles and exploits that Jonathan and his brothers had accomplished, and the hardships they had endured. Then he said, "Where can we find another man like him? Let us make him our friend and ally now." He wrote him a letter inviting him to be his ally. Jonathan's power grew significantly. As recounted in verses 59 to 66, on that occasion, Jonathan left Jerusalem with the elders of Judah and the priests and crossed the river to Ptolemais. He found favor in the eyes of both kings. They granted him and his companions gold, silver, and many gifts. King Alexander even requested that Jonathan be clothed in purple, and so it was done. As narrated in chapter 11, verses 1 to 7, the king of Egypt gathered forces as numerous as the sand on the seashore, along with many ships. He sought to seize Alexander's kingdom through cunning and annex it to his own. He set out for Syria with peaceful words, and the inhabitants of the cities opened their gates and went out to meet him. Alexander had ordered that he be received as he was his father-in-law. The political situation was complex and unstable. As described in verses 8 to 13, when Ptolemy entered the cities, he left garrison troops in each one. Upon approaching Ashdod, he was shown the burned temple of Dagon, the destroyed city and its suburbs, corpses scattered about, and the charred remains of those who had been burned in the war. The people told the king what Jonathan had done, attempting to make him detestable, but the king remained silent. Jonathan's diplomatic skill continued to grow. As narrated in verses 20 to 27, King Ptolemy became the ruler of the coastal cities, up to Seleucia by the sea, and harbored malicious intentions against Alexander. He sent envoys to King Demetrius, saying, "Come, let us make an alliance between us. I will give you my daughter, whom Alexander now possesses, and you shall reign over your father's kingdom. I regret having given my daughter to him, for he sought to kill me." Amid these dynastic disputes, Jonathan maintained his strong position. As told in verses 28 to 37, the king wrote him a letter in these terms: "To King Jonathan, our brother, and to the nation of the Jews, greetings. We are sending you a copy of the letter we wrote to Lasthenes, our relative, concerning you, so that you may be informed. King Demetrius to Lasthenes, his father, greetings. We have decided to treat the nation of the Jews well, for they are our friends and act justly toward us because of their goodwill toward us." Jonathan's authority grew both in military and religious matters. As described in verses 54 to 59, King Alexander honored him even more. He sent him a golden buckle, as was customary for the king's relatives, and granted him Ekron and all its territory as a possession. The situation changed dramatically when, as narrated in verses 60 to 74, the king of Egypt entered Antioch and placed 2 crowns upon his head, one of Asia and one of Egypt. But King Alexander was then in Cilicia, for the inhabitants of that region had revolted. Upon hearing of this, he marched against him to do battle. Ptolemy sent out his army, met him with great forces, and put him to flight. This period of political turbulence demanded great diplomatic skill. As told in chapter 12, verses 1 to 4, seeing that circumstances were in his favor, Jonathan sent envoys to Rome to confirm and renew the alliance with the Romans. He also sent letters to the Spartans and other places with the same intent. Jonathan's ability to maintain alliances was remarkable. As described in verses 5 to 18, his envoys arrived in Rome, entered the Senate, and said, "The high priest Jonathan and the nation of the Jews have sent us to renew the friendship and alliance with you under the same terms as before." The Senate provided them with letters for the authorities of each region, ensuring their safe return to the land of Judah. However, betrayal was near. As narrated in verses 39 to 53, Trypho aspired to become king of Asia, to wear the crown, and to seize power from King Antiochus. Fearing that Jonathan would oppose him and wage war against him, he sought a way to capture and kill him. He set out for Beth Shan. Jonathan went to meet him with 40,000 chosen men for battle and arrived at Beth Shan. Jonathan's end came through treachery. As recounted in the final verses of chapter 12, Trypho saw that Jonathan had come with a large army and was afraid to attack him directly. Instead, he received him with honors, introduced him to his friends, gave him gifts, and instructed his troops to obey Jonathan as they would himself. Then, using deception, he convinced Jonathan to dismiss his army and accompany him with only 1,000 men to Ptolemais, where he was betrayed and captured. With Jonathan's capture, his brother Simon took leadership at a critical moment. As narrated in chapter 13, verses 1 to 6, Simon learned that Trypho had gathered a great army to invade and devastate the land of Judah. Seeing that the people were fearful and distressed, he went up to Jerusalem, assembled the people, and exhorted them, saying, "You know how much I, my brothers, and my father's house have done for the commandments and the sanctuary and the wars and tribulations we have endured. Because of this, all my brothers have perished for the cause of Israel, and I alone remain." The people's response demonstrated their confidence in his leadership. As described in verses 7 to 11, upon hearing these words, their spirits were revived, and they responded in a loud voice, "You shall be our leader in place of Judas and Jonathan, your brothers. Fight our battles, and whatever you command, we will do." Simon then gathered all the men of war, hurried to complete the walls of Jerusalem, and fortified the city all around. Simon's first major test as a leader came soon. As narrated in verses 12 to 19, Trypho set out from Ptolemais with a large army to invade the land of Judah, bringing Jonathan as a prisoner. Simon camped at Adida, facing the plain. When Trypho learned that Simon had succeeded his brother Jonathan and was preparing to fight him, he sent messengers saying, "It is because of the money that your brother Jonathan owes to the royal treasury, due to the offices he held, that we are holding him. Now send 100 talents of silver and 2 of his sons as hostages, so that once released he will not rebel against us, and we will let him go." Simon's decision was painful. As described in verses 20 to 24, though he realized that Trypho was deceiving him, He sent the money and the boys to avoid stirring up hostility among the people who might say, "Jonathan perished because Simon did not send the money and the boys." So he sent them, along with the 100 talents. But Trypho lied and did not release Jonathan. As told in verses 23 to 30, Trypho came to invade the region and devastate it, making his way through Adora. But Simon and his army followed him wherever he went. The people of the citadel sent messengers to Trypho, urging him to reach them through the desert and to send them provisions. Trypho prepared his entire cavalry to go, but that night heavy snow fell, preventing him from proceeding. He then departed and went to the region of Gilead. When he approached Bascama, he killed Jonathan, who was buried there. As narrated in verses 33 to 42, Simon ordered his brother Jonathan's bones to be collected and buried in Modane, the city of their ancestors. All of Israel mourned deeply for him and lamented for many days. Simon built a tall monument over the tomb of his father and brothers, visible from a great distance, with polished stones at the front and back. He erected 7 pyramids, one in front of the other, for his father, mother, and 4 brothers. Around them, he constructed a grand structure with large columns, upon which he placed armor as an eternal memorial. Alongside the armor, he had ships sculpted, visible to all who sailed the sea. As described in verses 43 to 53, King Demetrius confirmed Simon as high priest, counted him among his friends, and bestowed great honors upon him. He had learned that the Romans had recognized the Jews as friends, allies, and brothers, and had received Simon's ambassadors with honors. The Jews and the priests then decided that Simon would be their leader and high priest forever, until a trustworthy prophet arose. As recounted in chapter 14, verses 4 to 15, the land of Judah enjoyed peace throughout Simon's reign. He sought the welfare of his nation. His power and glory were well regarded by his people during his entire rule. He increased the glory of his people, took Joppa as a port, and established an entryway to the islands of the sea. He expanded the nation's borders and maintained control over the land. The elders sat in the squares discussing the well-being of the land, while the young men dressed in splendor and in garments of war. As narrated in verses 27 to 45, on the 18th day of Elul in the year 172, the 3rd year of Simon's high priesthood in Asaramel, during the great assembly of priests, the people, the nation's leaders, and the elders of the land, the following was recorded. Many times wars have plagued our land. Simon, son of Matathias, a priest from the descendants of Joarib, and his brothers risked their lives and resisted the enemies of their nation, ensuring that the sanctuary and the law remained intact, bringing great glory upon their people. As described in verses 41 to 45, at that time the people began to inscribe on documents and contracts. In the 1st year of Simon, the great high priest, strategist, and leader of the Jews, Simon besieged Gazara, surrounded it with encampments, built a mobile siege tower, moved it close to the city, breached one of its towers, and seized it. As told in chapter 15, verses 1 to 9, Antiochus, son of King Demetrius, sent letters from the islands of the sea to Simon, the priest and ethnarch of the Jews, and to the entire nation. The content read, "King Antiochus to Simon, the high priest, and ethnarch, and to the Jewish nation greetings. Since wicked men have seized the kingdom of our ancestors, I intend to reclaim it and restore it to its former state." As narrated in chapter 16, verses 11 to 14, Ptolemy, son of Abubus, had been appointed strategist of the plains of Jericho. He possessed great wealth in silver and gold, as he was the high priest's son-in-law. Filled with pride, he sought to seize the land. He treacherously plotted against Simon and his sons, intending to eliminate them. As described in the final verses of chapter 16, Simon was visiting the cities of the land, overseeing their administration. In the year 177, in the 11th month, the month of Shabbat, he traveled to Jericho with his sons, Matathias and Judas. The son of Abubus deceitfully welcomed them into the small fortress of Dock, which he had built. He hosted a grand banquet for them, but had hidden men in the area. When Simon and his sons became intoxicated, Ptolemy and his men rose up, took their weapons, attacked Simon in the banquet hall, and killed him along with his 2 sons and some of his servants. After committing this great betrayal, Ptolemy wrote a report to the king, requesting that he send troops to aid him, promising to deliver the land and cities into his hands. He sent others to Gazara to kill John, and dispatched letters to military officers, inviting them to meet him with the promise of silver, gold, and gifts. He also sent men to occupy Jerusalem and the Temple Mount. As narrated in verses 21 to 24, someone ran ahead to Gazara and informed John of the murder of his father and brothers, adding, "He has sent men to kill you too." Upon hearing this, John was deeply shaken. He captured the men sent to assassinate him and executed them, having discovered their plot against his life. As revealed in the final verses of the book 23 to 24, the rest of John's story, his wars, his feats, the walls he built, and his other deeds, are recorded in the chronicles of his high priesthood from the day he succeeded his father. John Hyrcanus would continue the Hasmonean legacy, further expanding Israel's borders and strengthening the dynasty that his grandfather, Matathias, had established. Under his rule, Judea would experience its greatest period of prosperity and power since the days of King Solomon. The Hasmonean dynasty would continue to govern Judea for several more decades until the arrival of the Romans, marking one of the most significant periods in Jewish history. And so concludes the incredible narrative of the book of 1 Maccabees, a story of courage, faith, and perseverance that remains relevant to this day. A saga that shows us how a small family of priests led an entire people in the fight for their religious and cultural freedom, standing against one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. If this story of resistance and determination impressed you, don't keep it to yourself. Share this video with your friends and family, especially those interested in ancient history, religion, or simply inspiring tales of overcoming adversity. Did you know there are many other fascinating stories like this in the deuterocanonical books? If you want to learn more about these texts, banned from some religious traditions but holding incredible historical treasures, subscribe to the channel. We have plenty more content like this, specially prepared for you. Turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos on ancient history, sacred texts, and the incredible discoveries that connect the past to the present. Leave a like if you learned something new today, and tell us in the comments which part of this story stood out to you the most. See you in the next video.